The antiseptic smell hit me first, sharp, sterile, the kind of clean that never felt comforting. It felt like a warning, like the air itself was reminding me that bodies were fragile and mistakes were permanent. I was 8 months pregnant, and I'd grown used to carrying that smell home with me. It clung to my hair, my hoodie, my skin, like a second job I didn't get paid for. The waiting room of Dr. Avery Lang's private clinic hummed with quiet wealth. Leather chairs that didn't squeak, abstract art that probably cost more than my entire car, and a receptionist whose smile stayed polite but never reached her eyes. I sat carefully, because everything hurt now. My back ached in a deep, stubborn way that made me feel twice my age. My ankles were swollen enough to make my shoes feel like a bad joke. And my baby pressed against my ribs like she was already fighting for space, in a world that didn't make room for women like me. I rested both hands on the curve of my stomach and felt her move beneath my palms. A slow roll, then a sharp kick, as if she was reminding me that she was real, that she was here, that I couldn't fall apart today even if I wanted to. 7 months ago, I would have been terrified. Now I was just tired. Tired in a way that went deeper than sleep. Tired like my bones had learned the shape of stress and decided to keep it forever. The receptionist called my name Mrs. Miller in that honeyed, practiced voice, like she was offering me respect on a tray. She'd stopped correcting herself when I quietly said it was Miss now. Divorced women made people uncomfortable, especially in places like this. A ring missing from your finger wasn't just a detail here. It was a diagnosis. I looked up and nodded. I didn't bother standing. The effort felt monumental, like my body was made of wet sand. She told me Dr. Lang was running a few minutes behind, and that there was tea and water in the corner if I wanted it. I nodded again, pretending I might. Pretending I was the kind of person who drank herbal tea in a quiet luxury clinic instead of gulping gas station coffee between shifts. Instead, I reached for a glossy magazine on the side table, something about homes with floor-to-ceiling windows and kitchens so big they looked like a museum exhibit. The pages felt thick and expensive under my fingertips. Even paper was different when you had money. 6 months. That number lived in my chest like a bruise. 6 months since I'd signed divorce papers in a downtown office that smelled like old books and someone else's cologne. 6 months since I'd sat across from Damien Cross and watched him become a stranger in real time. What hurt wasn't that he looked angry. What hurt was that he looked empty. Not love, not hate, not even regret. Just absence, as I'd already been erased. The divorce had been quick and brutal in its efficiency. I remembered thinking the speed was almost its own kind of cruelty, like he couldn't wait to cut me out, to get back to his life without the inconvenience of my feelings. I told myself I didn't care. I told myself it was a relief. I told myself 100 lies because the truth was too sharp to hold in my bare hands. The truth was that I loved him with the kind of desperate intensity that burns you from the inside out, and I still didn't know where that love was supposed to go now. 2 weeks after the ink dried, I found out I was pregnant. 2 weeks after I'd moved into a studio apartment in a neighborhood where sirens sang me to sleep. 2 weeks after I'd started working double shifts at a diner near Pike Street, serving coffee to strangers who never looked up from their phones. I didn't tell Damien. I couldn't. Not because I didn't think he had the right to know he did, and that guilt gnawed at me every day, but because Damien Cross didn't do simple truths. He didn't do gentle conversations or shared decisions. He did ownership. He did control. And I couldn't risk him turning my pregnancy into another cage, no matter how soft he lined it. So I kept my secret and built my life around it. I budgeted down to the last dollar. I counted hours like they were oxygen. I pretended my swollen feet were normal. I smiled at customers even when my hips felt like they were splitting in half. And at night, when the city quieted, and my apartment felt too small to breathe in, I lay on my side with my hands on my stomach and whispered apologies to the tiny life I'd brought into chaos. I promised her I'd be enough, even if it killed me. The clinic door opened, and cold air swept in from outside, carrying the scent of rain and something expensive, woodsy, dark, familiar enough to make my stomach drop. I didn't look up right away. Wealthy people came and went here all day. Dr. Lang catered to a certain kind of client, the kind who expected discretion and paid for it. I told myself it was just another man in a tailored coat, but then I felt it, that prickling awareness at the base of my skull, the sensation of being watched the way you're watched when someone is deciding what you're worth. My fingers tightened on the magazine without me meaning to. My heart started that slow, heavy thud it only did when my body remembered something my mind tried to forget. I lifted my eyes, and the world tilted. He stood in the doorway like the clinic belonged to him, like the whole city belonged to him. Tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in black that looked simple, until you realized nothing about him was ever simple. His hair was shorter than I remembered, cut with sharp precision. A thin scar cut through one eyebrow, subtle but unmistakable, a reminder of the violence I'd never been allowed to fully understand while I was his wife. Damien Cross, my ex-husband, the man I'd loved, the man I'd left, the man who had signed papers and let me walk out like I was nothing. And behind him, because there was always someone behind him, was Noah Reed, his driver, his security, his shadow. Noah's eyes scanned the room with calm efficiency, reading every corner, every face, every exit. Then his gaze landed on me, and I saw recognition settle in like a quiet alarm. Time didn't stop. It just narrowed. Damien's attention moved across the waiting room with the lazy confidence of a predator assessing territory. Past an elderly couple whispering to each other. Past the receptionist who went stiff behind her desk. Past the art and the leather and the polished surfaces. Then he found me. His eyes locked on mine, dark and unreadable, and something shifted in his expression. Confusion. Recognition. And then, his gaze dropped, slowly, deliberately, down to the unmistakable swell of my belly, where my hands had been resting like a shield. The air between us changed. It thickened. It sharpened. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. I just sat there, 8 months pregnant and suddenly very, very aware of how small I was compared to the life Damien Cross had built around power. My daughter kicked under my palms, hard and insistent, like she could feel the storm walking toward us. And I realized, in one cold, sick heartbeat, that my carefully controlled world was about to shatter, because Damien Cross had seen the truth, and Damien Cross never let go of anything he considered his. I watched Damien Cross stand in the doorway like a verdict. For a second, I told myself my exhausted brain was imagining him, but Noah's eyes stayed fixed on me, calm and certain, and Damien's gaze kept drifting lower, pulled to the curve of my stomach as if it had its own gravity. The receptionist spoke with careful politeness, but Damien didn't react. He didn't acknowledge the clinic, the rules, the fact that other people existed. He just looked at me, and my body remembered the old instinct. Stay quiet, stay still. My daughter rolled under my palms, pressing into my lungs. I tried to breathe through it the way Dr. Lang had taught me, but the air kept catching. Fear did that. Damien did that. His eyes lifted back to mine, and something sharp moved across his face. Confusion, then recognition, then a cold kind of understanding that made my stomach tighten. He started walking toward me. It wasn't fast. It was controlled, inevitable, like the distance between us was an insult he intended to correct. The room went quiet without anyone meaning to. Even the magazine in my lap felt suddenly too loud, too flimsy, like I was a child playing grown-up in a place I didn't belong. He stopped close enough that I could smell him. Rain, cedar, and that darker note underneath that always reminded me of smoke. Damien's gaze moved over my face, then down again, and I realized he wasn't just seeing me. He was collecting evidence. The exhaustion, the swelling, the way I braced my belly like a shield. He angled his head in a silent command, the way he used to when he expected me to follow. I stayed seated. A flicker of irritation tightened his mouth. Then, impossibly, he crouched, bringing his face level with mine. The movement stole my breath. I saw the thin scar through his brow, the hard line of his jaw, the faint gold flecks in eyes that had once been my whole sky. His gaze dropped to my belly and the tension in his face sharpened into math. Counting. Timing. He asked how far along I was, quiet enough that only I could hear. I told him 8 months. I watched the calculation finish. I watched the answer become a conclusion. His expression shifted into something I didn't want to name. Not tenderness. Possession, like the world had just handed him proof. I tried to speak, to explain, to remind him that he'd signed the papers first. But the words tangled, because every explanation led back to the same humiliating truth. I'd been carrying his child alone. Damien's hand moved. Slowly. Not a grab, not a threat. A careful reach, like he was giving me time to pull away. My body didn't move. That made me furious at myself. I hated that he still had this power over my reflexes, this ability to make my instincts betray my intentions. His palm settled against the fabric over my stomach, broad and warm. The touch was electric, and then his hand trembled. Damien Cross's hand shook against my belly, as if he couldn't believe what he was touching. My daughter kicked, hard, right into his palm. He froze. His eyes widened, and for one breath I saw the man underneath the monster. Shock, awe, wonder, raw enough to hurt. His second hand joined the first, cradling my belly like it was glass. He asked why I hadn't told him. I tried to answer with the truth shaped like armor. We were divorced. He had wanted out. He had let me go. His jaw jumped. His fingers flexed against my stomach. Not painful, but firm, like he was holding himself back from doing something reckless. Noah shifted behind him, a subtle movement, as if he could sense Damien's control thinning. Damien rose to his full height. The room seemed to shrink around him. He glanced once toward the receptionist. Whatever he communicated with that look, it worked. Her face went pale. Her hands hovered as if she wasn't sure whether to speak or disappear. He made a decision I felt more than I saw. The air turned sharp, tight, like the moment before thunder breaks. He offered me his hand. It wasn't a request. It was a directive wrapped in gentleness. I should have refused. I should have stood on my own. But my back screamed, my feet ached, and my body was heavy, and his hand was right there, steady and warm. My daughter shifted again like she was voting for the path of least resistance. So I took it. The second my fingers curled around his, I knew the day was no longer mine. Damien told the clinic, in that calm, lethal way, that the appointment was over. Then he guided me toward the door, one hand at my elbow, the other drifting back to my belly like a compass finding north. Outside, Seattle rain waited, and I walked into it with my ex-husband, feeling the first crack in the life I'd built without him widen into a break. The cold hit me like a slap the moment we stepped outside. Seattle rain wasn't romantic when you were 8 months pregnant and running on fumes. It was just wet, heavy, relentless. It soaked into your sleeves, your hair, your patience. The kind of rain that made the whole city smell like asphalt and river water and old secrets. Damien moved like the weather couldn't touch him. Noah had the car ready before I even registered where we were going. A black SUV idled at the curb, windows tinted so dark they looked like a lie. The door opened the second we reached it, and Damien's hand stayed on my elbow with that gentle pressure that didn't leave room for negotiation. I told myself I could still choose. I told myself I could step back, turn around, walk away. My body didn't believe me. My body was tired. My body was heavy. My body was carrying a daughter who had decided my spine was her favorite punching bag. And my body remembered Damien in a way my mind hated. It remembered warmth. It remembered safety that came at a cost. It remembered that when he put a hand on me, the world tended to back off. Damien helped me into the SUV like I was breakable. That should have made me angry. Instead, it made something in my chest ache. Because no one had handled me with care in months, not really. I'd been living like a stray, making myself smaller, tougher, quieter. I'd been treating my own exhaustion like a personal failing. The door shut, sealing us into leather and soft heat and the faint scent of his cologne. Noah got in the front seat without a word. His posture was relaxed but alert, like he could hear danger in the city's heartbeat. Damien slid in beside me, close enough that our thighs almost touched. The space between us felt charged, crowded with everything we'd never finished saying. His hand found my belly again. Not a grab, not a claim, an anchor. My daughter shifted under his palm, and I saw his throat work as he swallowed. The wonder from the waiting room hadn't fully left his face. He looked wrecked, like the universe had handed him something sacred and he didn't trust himself not to crush it. I should have hated him for that. Instead, my eyes stung. I forced myself to look out the window, to focus on the rain streaking the glass, the blurred headlights, the city dissolving into watercolor. I asked where we were going, more because I needed to hear my own voice than because I expected an answer that mattered. Damien told me we were going home. The word home landed like a punch. I told him I had a home. A tiny studio with a mattress that squeaked and a neighbor who argued with his girlfriend through the wall at 2 a.m. A home where I'd learned to fall asleep with one hand on my stomach and the other gripping pepper spray. Damien didn't react like I'd said anything reasonable. He said, in that calm final way of his, that I didn't anymore. My anger flashed hot and sudden. It was the same anger that had kept me upright for 6 months. The anger that had paid my rent. The anger that had dragged me through double shifts when my feet felt like they were splitting. I told him he couldn't just decide things for me. Not anymore. Damien's jaw tightened. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His control was worse than shouting. His control was quiet, smooth, certain. He told me I was 8 months pregnant with his child, and that I had been living unprotected in a city that didn't forgive weakness. My stomach turned. Not because he was wrong, but because he sounded like he'd already built a case against me, like he'd been keeping score. I asked how he even knew where I lived. The smallest pause. Just a fraction of a second. Then Damien admitted he had always known. Every day since I left. The words slid under my skin like ice. I stared at him, trying to make my brain accept what my gut already knew. Damien didn't let go. Damien didn't stop watching. Damien didn't stop controlling the orbit of the things he loved, even when he pretended he was setting them free. I told him that wasn't protection. That was surveillance. He corrected me immediately, as if the distinction mattered, as if the intention made it clean. He said he had been making sure I was safe, that he had been making sure I was eating, that he had been making sure no one got close enough to hurt me. And the terrifying part was that I believed him, because Damien Cross didn't do half measures. If he watched with a whole team. If he protected like a fortress. I should have been disgusted. Instead, my throat tightened with a feeling I didn't want to name. Relief. Relief was the ugliest emotion sometimes. It showed you the parts of yourself that were willing to trade freedom for rest. I told him I wasn't his anymore. I reminded him we were divorced. Damien's mouth curved into something that wasn't a smile. A dark, humorless acknowledgement of how little paper meant to him. He told me a signature didn't change what I was to him. Then his hand pressed a little more firmly over my belly, and I understood what he really meant. It wasn't about me. Not only, it was about her. My daughter rolled under his palm, and his expression softened like the movement physically rewired him. It was so human it almost broke me. For a moment, the SUV felt too small. Damien's heat, his scent, his hand on my belly, the rain tapping against the glass like impatient fingers, it all pressed in until I couldn't tell if I wanted to scream or lean into him. The car turned, and the road smoothed out. The city changed. We crossed into the part of Seattle where money didn't shout. It whispered. Buildings grew taller and cleaner. The streets looked polished. Even the rain seemed more elegant here, falling on glass and steel instead of cracked pavement. My chest tightened again. But this time it wasn't anger. It was memory. Because I recognized the route. I recognized the way the skyline shifted. The angles. The quiet security cameras disguised as sleek architectural details. The doormen standing under awnings like they were guarding a kingdom. I saw the tower before the SUV even slowed. 30 stories of glass and steel that caught the gray daylight and turned it into something cold and expensive. I remembered the private elevator, the marble floors, the silence that came from living above the world. I remembered being Damien Cross's wife in a place like that and thinking it meant I was safe. I remembered how safety had started to feel like captivity. The SUV rolled to a stop under the awning. Noah was out immediately, moving around to open the door with the same smooth efficiency as before. Rain slid off his suit like it had been trained to. Damien leaned closer, his mouth near my ear, his voice low enough that it felt like a secret. He told me I was exhausted. He told me my body was carrying too much. He told me I was coming inside. It wasn't a threat. It was a promise. I stepped out into the rain with his hand steady on my back, and I realized something that made my stomach drop harder than any bump in the road. This wasn't a reunion. It was a reclaiming. And part of me, the tired, lonely part, the part that had been surviving on stubbornness and denial, was already losing the fight. The lobby smelled like polished stone and expensive restraint. Everything about that building was designed to make you feel smaller without ever touching you. The ceilings were too high. The lighting was too soft. The silence was too deliberate, as if noise itself wasn't allowed to exist in a place built for people who never had to rush. I felt every pair of eyes on me the second I stepped inside. Not because anyone recognized my face, but because pregnancy made you visible in a way I wasn't used to anymore. A belly that big turned you into a story people wrote in their heads. I could almost feel the assumptions forming, that I was careless, that I was irresponsible, that I was someone's burden. Damien's hand stayed at the small of my back, steady and proprietary. The pressure wasn't painful, but it was constant, and it did something dangerous to my nerves. It made me feel guided. It made me feel handled. It made me feel like I didn't belong to myself. Noah moved a half step behind us, scanning the lobby with the same quiet focus he'd had at the clinic. His eyes never settled. They swept, measured, calculated. A doorman looked up and stiffened, then recovered fast. I watched the man's expression shift into that particular kind of respect people wore around Damien. Not admiration, not friendliness, something closer to compliance. The doorman seemed to recognize me too. His gaze flicked to my belly, then back to my face, and I saw a flash of surprise that felt almost like judgment. A ghost of the life I used to live here. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself I didn't care. But my chest tightened anyway, because I remembered walking through this lobby as Damien's wife, trying to act like I wasn't afraid of the attention, trying to pretend the luxury didn't intimidate me. Back then, I used to think the building was a fortress. Now it felt like a museum exhibit of everything I'd lost. Damien guided me toward the private elevator. There were no buttons, no mirrored panel with numbers. Just a sleek scanner and a camera hidden so well you'd only notice if you already knew it was there. He placed his hand on the sensor. The system recognized him instantly. I hated how easily the doors opened for him. I hated how easily my life used to open for him too. Inside the elevator, the air felt warmer, cleaner. Too intimate for two people who had signed papers that were supposed to end something. The doors slid shut with a soft sound that felt like a decision being made without me. The elevator rose smoothly. No sway, no wobble. My stomach rolled anyway. Not from motion, from memory. I remembered standing in this elevator once in a white dress that had cost more than my mother's yearly rent. I remembered Damien's hand around my waist, his breath against my hair, the way he'd made a promise with his body language alone. I remembered believing him. I remembered breaking anyway. Damien watched me in the reflection of the elevator wall. He didn't need to move his head. His eyes tracked me like he could sense every thought I tried to hide. I kept my gaze forward. I told myself I wouldn't give him anything. Then my daughter kicked hard enough to make me flinch, and Damien's hand shifted from my back to my belly in a protective reflex, like his body had already memorized where it belonged. That simple instinct made my throat burn. I didn't want to be comforted by him. I didn't want to be owned by him. And yet my body reacted like comfort was a drug it had been deprived of for too long. The elevator chimed softly. The doors opened into a private foyer I knew too well. Marble floors. A piece of art that looked like it belonged in a gallery. A discreet camera in the corner. Another sensor by the penthouse door, because even the air up here was guarded. Damien stepped out first, then turned back to me. He offered his hand again like it was the most natural thing in the world. I told myself I could walk without him. My back disagreed. So I took his hand and stepped into the space I'd once called home. The penthouse looked the same at first glance. Floor-to-ceiling windows that turned the city into a glittering map. Furniture arranged like an interior designer's idea of power. Clean lines, cold colors, beauty with no softness. It was a place built to impress, not to comfort. My chest ached as I took it in, because I remembered the way I used to try to bring warmth into this space. Candles, throw blankets, music, little human touches that never quite fit the architecture. Damien had always said he didn't need any of that. He'd always said he only needed me. I took 2 more steps and realized something had changed. Flowers, white flowers, arranged in crystal vases on nearly every surface. Not random bouquets, not generic decoration. The exact kind I loved. The ones I used to buy for myself once a month as a stupid little act of self-respect. The sight hit me harder than I expected. Because it meant he remembered. Because it meant he had been thinking about me in ways that didn't match the emptiness he'd worn at the divorce table. Damien's hand remained on my waist as he guided me deeper into the penthouse. He moved carefully, as if he was suddenly aware of how heavy my body was, how much effort it took to exist right now. I told myself he was doing it because of the baby. That thought didn't help. On the coffee table, a stack of books sat perfectly aligned. At first, I assumed they were business books. Damien always had books around he never read, like props for a life he didn't need to perform. Then I saw the titles. Pregnancy guides, parenting manuals, newborn care books. My stomach twisted. I moved closer, drawn in despite myself. Sticky notes marked pages. Lines were highlighted. There were small, precise notes in the margins, written in Damien's sharp handwriting. Not sloppy, not casual, meticulous. He had underlined sections about due dates, warning signs, nutrition, postpartum recovery. He had written reminders like he was training for a job he refused to fail. I stared at those notes and felt something crack open in my chest. This wasn't just obsession. This was preparation. This was devotion expressed through control and research and planning. It should have comforted me. It should have terrified me. It did both at once. Damien watched my face as I processed it, and I sensed him waiting for me to soften, to melt, to surrender to the evidence that he cared. I didn't. Not fully. Because caring wasn't the problem. The problem was what Damien did with the things he cared about. I felt him shift behind me. I felt his presence close in, heat and authority and familiarity. His hands returned to my belly with that reverent certainty, and my daughter responded with another kick, as if she recognized him now. Damien's breath left him in a slow exhale that sounded almost unsteady. He told me I was staying here. He told me I wasn't leaving alone. He told me the days of me being unprotected were over. I listened, standing in the middle of a penthouse filled with flowers and baby books, and I realized the trap wasn't going to look like chains. It was going to look like comfort. It was going to look like safety. It was going to look like everything my exhausted heart secretly wanted. And that was exactly why I was scared. That first night back in Damien's penthouse, sleep felt like a rumor other people got to believe in. The bed was too soft, too familiar, and memory sat in the corners like dust you couldn't sweep away. The sheets smelled faintly of detergent and something darker underneath his cologne. Maybe, or the imprint of him that never fully left this place. My body should have collapsed the second my head hit the pillow. I had been running on adrenaline for hours, and pregnancy at 8 months made exhaustion feel physical, like carrying a second skeleton inside your skin. But my mind wouldn't stop. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the clinic waiting room again. Damien's face when he looked at my belly. The way his hand had trembled. The way I'd let him lead me out like I didn't have a choice, even though part of me knew I did. I lay on my side, one hand braced under my stomach, the other splayed over the curve of my belly, trying to breathe through the slow ache in my back. My daughter moved. A long stretch, then a sharp kick, like she was practicing for a world that would demand toughness from her the moment she arrived. She pressed into my ribs, and I winced. I whispered apologies into the darkness without realizing I was doing it. Apologies for the stress. Apologies for the fear. Apologies for the fact that her father was a man who could turn an entire room silent just by walking into it. I told myself I was doing this for her. That was true. But it wasn't the whole truth. The whole truth was that I was scared of being alone again. Scared of waking up in my tiny studio with sirens outside and no one to call if something went wrong. Scared of the shadow I couldn't quite prove had been watching me for months. And I hated myself for that fear. Because fear made you compromise. Fear made you accept a hand on your back and call it safety. Sometime after midnight, I gave up on pretending sleep was coming. I shifted slowly, carefully, until I could sit up without feeling like my spine might split. The city glowed beyond the windows, thousands of lights smeared by rain. From this height, Seattle looked quiet and manageable, like you could reach down and move the streets around like pieces on a board. I knew better. I slid my feet onto the floor and stood. My joints complained immediately. I moved one hand to my lower back, the other still on my belly, and took a few slow steps out of the bedroom. The penthouse was dim, lit mostly by the city and the small accent lights Damien kept on at night. Everything looked even more expensive in the half-dark, as if luxury belonged to shadows the way Damien did. I told myself I was just getting water, but I didn't turn toward the kitchen. I drifted down the hallway instead, drawn by a faint glow that didn't match the rest of the sleeping space. His office. The door was partially open, and a slice of light cut across the floor like a warning line. I hesitated, my pulse quickening. Damien working late wasn't unusual. It had been part of our marriage. The business never slept. The men never stopped coming. The phones never stayed quiet. Back then, I used to pretend it didn't bother me. Now, standing barefoot in his hallway, I realized how much it had shaped me. How often I'd tried to earn his calm by being quiet enough not to add to his chaos. I stepped closer. Damien sat behind a desk that looked carved out of the night itself. The glow came from multiple screens. Security feeds, maps, messages. His sleeves were rolled up, exposing forearms corded with muscle and marked with pale scars. I remembered tracing with my fingertips when I was still allowed to pretend his world wasn't violent. He looked up as if he'd been expecting me. He didn't seem surprised to see me awake. If anything, his expression softened, and the shift was so immediate it made my throat tighten. Like the sight of me in the doorway pulled him out of whatever darkness he'd been swimming in. He rose slowly, moving toward me with that controlled grace that never felt fully human. When he got close, his gaze dropped to my belly first, instinctive, like he couldn't help checking that we were still here. I told him I couldn't sleep. He studied my face like he was reading damage, then asked if I was in pain. I wanted to say I was fine, because that was my default. Fine was how I survived. Fine was what you said when you didn't want to owe anyone softness. But the truth was heavier than pride tonight. So I admitted I was uncomfortable, restless, that my daughter was acting like it was midday and not the middle of the night. Something almost like amusement flickered across Damien's face. It wasn't a smile. Not quite. But it was warmer than anything I'd seen from him since the divorce. He told me she sounded stubborn. The word stubborn landed like a strange kind of blessing. He sounded proud, like her strength belonged to him too. Damien stepped closer and placed both hands on my belly without asking. I should have moved away. I should have reminded him of boundaries. I should have said something about consent, about how touch didn't erase what had happened between us. But my daughter kicked right into his palms, as if she recognized him now, as if she'd already decided he was part of her world. Damien's breath hitched. His hands stayed still for a moment, then gently shifted, cradling the curve of my stomach as if he was trying to memorize the shape. His eyes closed briefly, and that single vulnerable gesture undid me more than any threat could have, because it made him look human. It made him look like a man terrified of missing something important again. He told me he wanted to show me something. I followed him because my feet moved before my pride could stop them. He led me down the hallway to a door I remembered as a guest room, a space that had never mattered to me before. A room I'd ignored because the penthouse had always been full of rooms that existed more for display than for life. Damien opened it, and the light inside poured out soft and warm. I stopped in the doorway and forgot how to breathe. It was a nursery. Not a rushed, half-finished attempt. Not a cold designer concept. A real nursery. Complete, thoughtful, personal. The walls were painted a muted sage that made the space feel calm instead of sterile. A white crib stood against one wall, made up with bedding patterned with tiny woodland animals. A rocking chair sat near the window, angled to catch morning light. Shelves held stacks of children's books, board books, picture books, even a few classics I remembered loving as a kid. There was a mobile above a changing table, small felt stars and moons spinning gently in the current of the air. I walked in slowly, as if the room might vanish if I moved too fast. My fingers brushed the crib rail, smooth, solid, real. My eyes burned. I asked when he had done this. Damien told me it happened fast, right after he learned about the pregnancy. That answer didn't make sense yet. Nothing about his timing made sense. The clinic, the books, the flowers, this room. My chest tightened as another thought formed, colder than emotion. He hadn't just prepared a space. He had prepared a life. A life that included me whether I agreed or not. Damien moved behind me and rested his hands on my belly again. Gentle but firm, like he was anchoring himself. He told me he wasn't going to fail our daughter, that he wasn't going to miss another moment. He called it a vow. I heard the desperation under it. Then he added what he really meant, that he wanted me back here, permanently, where he could keep me safe. The word safe sounded different in that room. Softer, more convincing. That scared me most of all. I turned as carefully as I could and faced him. I took in the dark circles under his eyes, the tension he carried like it was fused to his spine, the way his hands hovered near my belly as if letting go would hurt. I admitted I needed time to think, time to breathe, time to remember who I was without him. Damien listened, and for a moment I thought he might give it to me. Then he told me I had until tomorrow afternoon. Not as a threat, as a deadline, as if the world was already moving and he was simply informing me of the schedule. I stared at him in the soft nursery light, my daughter shifting between us like the only innocent thing in the room, and I realized the next day wasn't going to be about whether Damien could persuade me. It was going to be about whether I could hold on to myself while he tried. Morning arrived like nothing had happened, and that was the most unsettling part. Sunlight filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows, turning the gray city into something almost golden. The rain had eased overnight, leaving the skyline washed clean, as if the world wanted to pretend it was new. I didn't feel new. I felt like I'd been dropped back into a life I'd fought to escape, and my body remembered every corner of it. My feet hit the warm floor, and I immediately needed the bathroom. 8 months pregnant meant my bladder ran my schedule now. By the time I washed my hands and looked in the mirror, I barely recognized myself. Puffy eyes, tangled hair, a face that held too many sleepless hours. I told my reflection to get it together. I told myself I could handle one day. When I stepped into the main living space, the smell of coffee hit me first. Real coffee. Fresh. Not the stale diner pot I'd been living on. A breakfast spread waited on the dining table like someone had staged a magazine shoot. Fruit cut perfectly, eggs, toast, yogurt, pastries I couldn't pronounce, and a carafe of coffee beside a smaller one that I immediately recognized as decaf. The decaf detail did something dangerous to me, because it meant Damien remembered the little things, the kind of things you only remember when you're paying attention on purpose. Damien was already dressed, sharp and composed, as if he hadn't been up most of the night staring at security feeds. He looked like a man built for control. Dark shirt, sleeves buttoned, hair neat, face clean-shaven except for the faint shadow that always made him look more tired than he allowed anyone to notice. His attention moved to me the moment I appeared. Not my face first. My belly. His eyes tracked the curve like he was checking that I was still here, still intact, still real. Then he crossed the room and guided me toward the chair he'd chosen, his hand hovering at my lower back as if he couldn't help it. The touch didn't hurt. It didn't even feel forceful. It felt inevitable. I told myself to pull away. My body didn't. He made it clear, through calm gestures and minimal words, that he intended to feed me like it was his responsibility. He started building a plate for me with the focused seriousness of someone defusing a bomb. I tried to insist I could handle it. I tried to remind him I'd been feeding myself for months. I tried to sound firm, but my voice didn't carry the authority it used to. Exhaustion stole strength the way the ocean steals sand. It didn't do it dramatically. It did it slowly, patiently, until you looked up and realized the ground had changed beneath you. Damien set the plate in front of me and watched as I ate. That watching made me uncomfortable in a way I couldn't fully explain. It wasn't lust. It wasn't hunger. It was relief. Like he'd been starving for proof I was alive. I took small bites, mostly because I didn't trust my stomach. Pregnancy, nausea, didn't care about luxury. It showed up whenever it wanted. My daughter rolled as I chewed, then kicked once as if she approved of the food. Damien's expression softened so briefly I almost missed it. That softening was his most dangerous weapon, because it made me forget, just for a moment, that he was the kind of man who could end problems with a phone call. The kind of man who didn't have to ask permission. I was in the middle of my second bite of eggs when the temperature in the room changed. Not literally, emotionally. Like the air tightened. I noticed it because Damien noticed it. His posture shifted, subtle but complete, the way it used to when someone texted him news that wasn't safe to ignore. The gentle presence beside me sharpened into something colder. Noah appeared at the edge of the dining room, silent as always, but the set of his shoulders told me everything. He wasn't panicked. He wasn't rushed. He was alert. Damien's eyes lifted to him with a question that didn't need words. Noah answered in the same minimal way, keeping his voice low, like he understood I didn't need every detail. But I caught enough. There was a situation. Someone had been asking questions about me, about the pregnancy, about where I'd been living. Damien's hand, which had been resting lightly on my knee under the table, tightened, not painfully. Just enough to remind me it was there. Just enough to remind me who he thought I belonged to. I felt the blood drain from my face. I tried to swallow, but my throat felt too small. Noah's report continued in measured pieces, someone persistent, someone professional, someone who knew things they shouldn't, not gossip, not curiosity, the kind of interest that felt like a file being built. My stomach turned. I asked how long. Noah's eyes flicked toward me for a brief second, then away, and I understood what that look meant. Long enough to make this worse. He explained that it had been going on for at least 2 months. 2 months. The number hit like a physical blow. 2 months meant someone had started tracking me before Damien even appeared at the clinic. Before he knew. Before he could protect me in his own controlling way. It meant I had been visible without knowing it. I pictured my studio apartment, the cracked blinds, the streetlight outside my window. The nights I'd walked home alone with my keys threaded between my fingers like a weapon. I pictured someone watching from a car, a doorway, across the street. Someone recording my schedule, my shifts, my doctor appointments, my life. A wave of nausea rose fast and violent. Damien was beside me immediately, crouching so we were eye level, his hands framing my face as if he needed to force me into the present. His touch was steady. His eyes were not. They were darker now, harder. He communicated, without softness, that I didn't need to worry because he was handling it. That reassurance should have helped. It didn't, because it came from the same kind of certainty that had erased my choices before. I tried to insist I did need to worry. I tried to explain that someone stalking a pregnant woman for 2 months was not something you brushed away with a promise. Damien didn't argue. He didn't comfort. He turned his head slightly and gave Noah orders like he was moving pieces on a board. More security. Full surveillance review around my building. Every camera. Every face. Every vehicle that had lingered too long. Trace the numbers. Find the source. And do it fast. Noah nodded once, already moving. Damien's focus returned to me. And it was almost worse than the orders. The intensity of it. The way he looked at me like the world had just proven him right. I realized, sitting at that table with half-eaten breakfast and my hands trembling in my lap, that the danger wasn't hypothetical. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't just the dark edge that came with loving a man like Damien Cross. It was real. Someone out there had been watching me, planning something, building a case or a trap or both, and I had been walking through my days thinking I was just a tired pregnant woman trying to survive. Damien's hand slid back to my belly, slow and protective, and my daughter kicked again as if she could feel the fear leaking into my bloodstream. I looked at Damien, at the cold focus in his eyes, at the way his jaw set like stone, at the quiet violence in the calm he wore like a suit, and I understood something I didn't want to understand. If someone had been hunting me, Damien was going to hunt back. And whatever happened next, my life was no longer mine to manage in silence. By the time Noah disappeared to execute Damien's orders, my appetite was gone. The eggs on my plate looked wrong now. The fruit looked like decoration. The whole breakfast spread felt like a performance stage to distract me from the fact that someone had been building a file on my life while I was out there pretending I was invisible. Damien stayed close, watching my face like he expected me to break. Maybe he wanted me to. Because if I broke, he could catch the pieces and decide how they fit back together. That thought lit a slow anger in my chest, hotter than fear, steadier than panic. I had spent 6 months rebuilding myself from nothing. I had learned how to drag my body out of bed when it felt like stone. I had learned how to smile at strangers while my feet swelled and my back screamed. I had learned how to survive without a safety net. I was not going to hand that hard-earned strength back to Damien Cross just because the world had proved itself dangerous. My daughter shifted, a long roll that pressed into my palm when I rested my hand on my belly. She felt like an anchor and a warning at the same time. She reminded me that this wasn't only about pride anymore. It was about the kind of life I was about to give her. I told Damien, as calmly as I could manage, that being scared didn't mean I was surrendering. He studied me with that intensity that always made me feel like he was trying to memorize every breath I took. He didn't argue. He didn't soften. He simply waited, like he had all the time in the world, and I was the one on a deadline. That used to work on me. It didn't today. I made myself stand even though my hips protested. I moved slowly, keeping my posture steady, refusing to wobble like a fragile thing. I hated that I cared about looking strong in front of him, but I cared anyway. I hated that I had to remind myself I was allowed to take up space. I walked toward the windows, more for the distance than the view. The city stretched below us, busy and indifferent. From up here, everyone looked like ants, tiny lives, tiny problems. And yet one unseen person had still been able to reach into my life and shake it. Damien followed me, close but not touching. I felt the restraint in that choice. I felt him trying to prove he could listen. I turned to face him and told him there would be rules if I stayed here. Not requests. Rules. Damien's eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but in focus. Like he respected structure, like he understood contracts. I told him the first condition was medical. My doctor, my choices, my body. He could be present. He could care. He could hover if he needed to. But he would not override me. He would not cancel appointments without my consent. He would not decide where I delivered, or who touched me. I watched him absorb that. His jaw tightened once. Then he gave a small, controlled nod that told me he accepted it, even if he didn't like it. My heart beat a little harder. I told him the second condition was my phone, my money, and my work. No one was to touch those without asking. Not him. Not Noah. Not a private assistant I didn't know existed. I had fought too hard to rebuild independence just to have it quietly dismantled under the excuse of protection. Damien's expression flickered. Something like discomfort, maybe. Like he was realizing this wasn't going to be the old version of marriage where he handled everything and I adapted. Good. I told him the third condition was movement. If I wanted to leave this penthouse, I could. Not alone. Not stupidly. Not when there was a real threat. But I would not be locked away. If he needed a security escort, fine. If Noah needed to drive, fine. If Damien wanted to come, we could negotiate that too. But I was not going to live like a hidden object he put on a shelf. Damien's gaze dropped to my belly again, reflexive. His face tightened like the idea of me outside his reach physically hurt him. I didn't let that stop me. I told him the fourth condition was information. I didn't need every ugly detail of his world, but I needed the shape of the truth. If someone was stalking me, I deserved to know what was happening and what the plan was. Not after it was over, not after he had already handled it in whatever way he considered efficient. I needed enough truth to make choices and protect myself too. Damien's mouth pressed into a line. His eyes held that familiar steel, the kind that used to shut conversations down. For a second I worried he'd refuse. Then I saw his throat work as he swallowed. I saw the tension shift in his shoulders. And he gave another nod, slower this time. It felt like watching a man force himself to loosen his grip on something he was terrified of losing. My chest hurt with it. I told him the fifth condition was the hardest to say out loud. It was about what he did to threats. Because I knew Damien. I knew how he solved problems. I knew how cleanly things disappeared when he wanted them to. I had spent years living beside that darkness while pretending I didn't see it. I admitted that I couldn't control him. Not really. I couldn't scrub his past clean, and I couldn't demand he become a different man overnight. But I could draw a line around my child's future. I told him I would not have my daughter raised on revenge. I would not have her story stained by blood he spilled in my name. I needed him to use his power intelligently first. Lawyers, leverage, protection plans, restraining orders that actually meant something when backed by real influence. I needed him to treat violence like the last option, not the first instinct. Damien's expression went still. The silence that followed was heavy enough to bend. For a moment, I thought I'd pushed too far. I thought he would snap back into the man who believed ownership was love. Then he did something unexpected. He stepped closer, but he still didn't touch me. He looked at my face the way you look at someone you're afraid you don't deserve. He let the mask slip just enough for me to see the exhaustion underneath, the regret that lived in the shadows of his eyes. He made it clear, without softness but with honesty, that he didn't like being told what to do. Then he made it clear, with the same brutal honesty, that he understood why I was doing it. He acknowledged that the divorce had been a mistake, not because he stopped loving me, because he thought he was poison. The words landed like a crack through my chest. I had told myself 100 stories to survive. That he didn't care, that I wasn't enough, that he had replaced me without a second thought. Those stories were ugly, but they kept me upright. Hearing that he had let me go because he believed he would destroy me felt like someone yanking the floor out from under all my coping lies. I wanted to scream at him for being a coward. I wanted to cry because part of me understood the twisted logic, and I wanted to hate myself for the way my heart still leaned toward him when he showed even a sliver of humanity. My daughter kicked hard, as if she was reminding me to stay in the present, as if she was warning me not to get lost in old love. I took a breath and told Damien that agreeing to my conditions wouldn't make me his again. Not automatically. It would only mean I was willing to stay for now. Willing to let him protect us while we figured out what the threat was. Willing to see if he could love me without consuming me. Damien's eyes held mine, dark and relentless, like he wanted to burn that promise into my bones. He gave me a final nod, sharp and certain. Then he lifted one hand slowly and waited, giving me the choice. I hesitated. Not because I didn't want comfort, because I was scared of how much I wanted it. At 9:30 that morning, standing in front of a wall of glass with Seattle spread out beneath us, I finally placed my hand into his, and when his fingers closed around mine, steady and warm, I realized the bargain I'd just made. I wasn't surrendering. I was negotiating, and for the first time since the clinic, I felt something new settle in my chest beside the fear. Control, not his. Mine. By 11:15, the penthouse had changed its mood completely. The sunlight was still pouring in through the windows, turning the city bright and harmless, but inside Damien's world, light didn't mean safety. It only meant you could see what was coming. Noah returned without rushing, which was how I knew the news was bad. He never moved fast unless bullets were already in the air. Calm was his language. Calm meant control. Calm meant the danger had already been measured and filed into categories. Damien was in his office again, half a step away from becoming the man I remembered from our marriage, the one who could hold tenderness in one hand and a threat in the other without flinching. I stayed near the doorway, one hand on my belly, the other braced lightly on the chair as if I needed proof the floor was real. Noah gave his report in pieces, the way you deliver information when you're trying not to drown someone in it. I could tell he was filtering it for my benefit, choosing the safest words, keeping the sharp edges out, but the shape of it still came through. They had traced the questions about me back to a location downtown, near the warehouse district. Not a single person, not a casual snoop. Someone with equipment, someone with time and patience and a professional method. Noah mentioned cameras, long-range lenses, notes, dates, and then he said something that made my breath catch so hard it hurt. It wasn't just me. There were files on other women, pregnant women. The room seemed to tilt the way it had in the clinic. Only this time it wasn't love or shock doing it. It was pure, cold fear. My fingers tightened on the edge of the chair. I felt my daughter shift under my palm. A slow roll like she was uncomfortable with the tension bleeding into my bloodstream. Noah's eyes flicked to me once, quick and careful, as if he was checking whether I was about to fall apart. Then he kept going, steady and precise. They had identified at least 6 women so far, all pregnant, all tracked with the same quiet thoroughness. Schedules, addresses, medical appointments, patterns. And the worst part wasn't the number. The worst part was the connection. Noah explained that the women weren't random. They were linked to families in Damien's orbit, not necessarily wives of his men, not necessarily public figures, but connected by blood, by marriage, by history, by proximity to the kind of power that attracted predators. My stomach flipped. Nausea surged so fast I had to swallow hard and breathe through my nose the way Dr. Lang had taught me. 6 women, 6 babies, 6 targets. I wasn't a tragic coincidence in someone else's love story. I was part of a pattern. Damien's face went still in a way that made my skin prickle. I had seen that stillness before, back when I didn't understand what it meant. I used to think it was calm. Now I knew it was the moment he stopped feeling things like hesitation. He asked Noah where the person was. Noah said they had eyes on him. A small room above a pawn shop near the warehouses. Enough surveillance equipment to make it clear this wasn't a hobby. This was a job. Damien didn't pace. He didn't shout. He didn't throw anything the way men in movies did. He only gave orders. Alive. Contained. Brought in. He wanted answers. He wanted the source. He wanted to know what kind of person chooses pregnant women as targets and why. The words weren't spoken loudly, but the intent behind them filled the room like smoke. Damien wasn't just talking about safety protocols. He was talking about ownership being threatened. And even though that possessive instinct should have angered me, the truth was uglier. I was grateful. Gratitude felt like betrayal of my own independence. But it was there anyway. Because someone had been watching me. Someone had been building a map to my life. And I didn't have the money or the power to crush that kind of threat alone. Damien did. My daughter kicked once, sharp and sudden, as if she disliked the storm in the air. I pressed my palm against the spot where she moved and tried to steady myself. My heart was beating too fast. My skin felt too tight. I asked, as evenly as I could, what the person wanted. Noah admitted they didn't know yet. Not fully. But the setup suggested leverage information collected like currency. Targets chosen for their value to someone else. Damien's jaw tightened. He looked at me, then at my belly, and I saw an internal battle flash across his face. My conditions, the boundaries I had set, the line I had drawn around violence. He didn't promise me anything out loud, but I felt the strain in his restraint, like he wanted to tell me not to worry, but he knew that sentence had become meaningless. Like he wanted to take me out of the conversation entirely, but he'd agreed I deserved the shape of the truth. He did the best compromise he could manage. He told me I was safe here, and that the threat was being handled. Then he gave Noah another set of instructions that sounded like strategy more than rage. More cameras, more background checks, quiet outreach to the other families, extra protection offered without panic. It was almost responsible. That scared me too, because it meant Damien wasn't improvising. He was assembling an entire machine around me, around her. I felt the room spin again. Not from fear this time, but from the sudden understanding of what my life was becoming. Not just a romance, not just a reconciliation, a security operation. Damien moved toward me, closing the space carefully, like he remembered I was carrying weight he couldn't feel. His hand hovered near my waist, then stopped short, as if he was reminding himself not to touch without consent. That small pause mattered. It meant he was trying. I asked quietly where he was going. He made it clear he was leaving to get answers in person. And even without direct words, I understood the rest. He trusted himself to control the situation, and he trusted no one else with something this close to his heart. My throat tightened. I hated the fear, but it spilled out anyway. I told him to be careful. The corner of his mouth lifted, not into warmth, but into that dangerous confidence I remembered too well. He looked like a man who believed caution was for everyone else. Noah moved toward the door with him, already preparing. Damien glanced back at me one last time. His eyes flicked to my belly, then returned to my face, and the intensity there made my chest ache. It wasn't romance in the soft, safe sense. It was devotion sharpened into a weapon. When the door closed behind them, the penthouse felt too large and too quiet. I stood there with both hands on my stomach, feeling my daughter roll and settle, as if she was trying to find a safer position inside me. At 11:48, with the city glittering innocently beyond the glass, I realized the scariest part. I wasn't just afraid of the person in the warehouse district. I was afraid of what I would be willing to accept from Damien Cross if it meant my baby never became someone else's file. Part 9, The Monster Comes Home, is approximately equal to 900 words. At 1840, the sky outside the windows had turned the color of old steel. Seattle sunsets could be beautiful, but tonight the light looked bruised. The city glittered anyway, indifferent and busy, as if nothing in my world had changed. as if there wasn't a man downtown in a room above a pawn shop who had turned pregnant women into a project, as if my life wasn't being rewritten behind closed doors. I spent most of the afternoon in a strange limbo, too safe to run, too anxious to rest. Noah's absence made the penthouse feel less guarded, even though I knew there were cameras and silent alarms and people I would never see standing watch in places I didn't have access to. Damien had built security the way other men built fences. Quietly, completely. That knowledge should have calmed me. Instead, it made me feel like I was living inside someone else's plan. I paced until my back throbbed, then sat until my hips ached. I tried to read one of the pregnancy books on the coffee table and kept staring at Damien's handwriting in the margins, like it might translate him into something easier to love. Somewhere around 2015, around 8:15 at night, the baby settled into a rhythm that felt like impatience. A roll, a kick, a pause, then another kick. She didn't like tension. She didn't like waiting. Neither did I. I kept hearing my own conditions in my head like a list I clung to for sanity. Medical choices, privacy, movement, information, no revenge. I wondered which of those rules Damien Cross would keep when he was angry. I wondered which of those rules he would break without even realizing it. Because to him, control was love, and love was survival. By 21, I had convinced myself I wouldn't cry. By 21.5, my eyes were burning anyway. Not because I was weak, because I was tired of being brave. I leaned on the nursery doorway, staring at the crib and the rocking chair and the soft sage walls. This room was comfort with teeth. It looked like hope, but it also looked like a future where my choices were constantly for my own good. My daughter kicked again hard enough to make me wince, and I pressed my palm to my belly and whispered that I knew, that I was trying, that we would be okay. Then the penthouse went subtly still, like the air itself was listening. I didn't hear footsteps right away. Damien didn't announce himself. He never had to. The door had security layers that didn't require noise. He moved through silence like he owned it, but my body knew. The hairs on the back of my neck lifted. My pulse jumped, and then I smelled him. Not just cedar and rain. Soap, fresh water, and underneath it, metallic, wrong, like pennies held too long in a sweaty palm. Blood. The scent came and went quickly, hidden under expensive cologne. But it was there. It was enough. I stayed in the nursery doorway, frozen. My hand slid down to hold the underside of my belly instinctively, protective in the oldest way. Damien appeared in the hall, coat gone, sleeves rolled up again, shirt collar slightly open like he'd been moving too hard for too long. His face looked clean. His hair was neat. He looked composed, but his eyes were darker than they had been this morning. He saw me and stopped, as if he'd expected me to be asleep. As if he'd hoped he could come back, wash away whatever he'd done, and return to being gentle before I noticed the truth clinging to him. He took one step closer, then another. Slow, deliberate, like he was approaching an animal he didn't want to startle. He looked at my belly first. The same reflex every time. His gaze softened for a fraction of a second, then lifted to my face, searching. He conveyed that he was home. He conveyed that I was safe. He conveyed that I didn't need to worry anymore. I should have felt relief. Instead, my throat tightened around the question that had been building in me all day. I asked, as quietly as I could, whether he had hurt someone. Damien's face didn't flinch, but something in his posture shifted. A subtle bracing, like he was preparing for impact. Like he knew this was the part where my love always got complicated. He didn't give me details. He didn't describe what happened. He didn't offer the kind of confession that would stain my mind. But his silence wasn't denial. It was control. He communicated that the person was contained, that the immediate threat was handled, that he still needed answers, and he would get them. His jaw tightened as if he was holding back a storm of anger he didn't want me to witness. I hated that part of me felt grateful anyway. I hated that the relief came so fast, so easy, because it meant something ugly about me was waking up, a part that could accept darkness if it meant my daughter stayed safe. Damien closed the distance and stopped close enough that his warmth brushed my skin. He didn't touch me right away. That restraint mattered. I could tell he was remembering my rules, or trying to. Then he lifted a hand and, with a careful pause that gave me the chance to refuse, rested his palm against my stomach. My daughter kicked into him immediately, as if she'd been waiting for his return. As if she recognized his energy in the air. Damien's eyes closed. His shoulders dropped a fraction. Something in his face loosened, and for one breath he looked less like a crime boss and more like a man who had been holding his own fear in his teeth all day. I wanted to keep my distance. I wanted to keep my anger intact, but my body leaned toward him anyway, betrayed by its own memory of being held. Damien's other hand rose, hovering near my waist, waiting. I let him touch me, not because I had forgotten what he was, because I remembered what it felt like to be safe for the first time in months. He guided me out of the nursery and toward the bedroom with a gentleness that didn't match the blood scent I couldn't forget. He moved like I was precious, like I was breakable, like he would rather shatter the world than let it bruise me again. In the bedroom, he sat beside me on the edge of the bed and looked at my face as if he was checking for cracks. He conveyed that he hated being away from me, that he hated the idea of someone watching me, that the thought of our daughter as a target made something in him go feral. I saw the truth of that in his eyes, and it scared me because it wasn't just anger. It was devotion without breaks. I asked him if he could do this differently, if he could protect without turning protection into a prison. Damien's gaze held mine like a vow. He didn't pretend he was gentle. He didn't promise he was safe. He promised he was here. He promised he would learn, even if it wasn't natural to him, even if it hurt, even if he had to fight himself to do it. My eyes stung again, and this time I didn't stop it, because I realized something simple and brutal. I didn't need Damien to be a saint. I needed him to be accountable. I needed him to treat my boundaries like law, not like suggestions. Damien leaned in and pressed his forehead against mine, careful of my belly, close enough that his breath warmed my upper lip. I kissed him. Not soft, not tentative. A real kiss, desperate and honest, fueled by 6 months of loneliness and the terror of being hunted, and the unbearable relief of him coming back alive. When I pulled away, my heartbeat felt loud in my ears. Damien kept his hand on my belly, anchoring himself to the life we'd made together. And I realized my biggest fear wasn't the stalker anymore. My biggest fear was that tomorrow would arrive, and I would have to choose what this meant. Whether I was staying in this world because I wanted to, or because I was too tired to fight it. And as my daughter rolled under Damien's palm like she belonged there, I felt the answer forming in my chest, quiet, dangerous, and undeniable. At 7:10, a pale winter light slid across the bedroom floor and landed on the side of the bed Damien hadn't left. I woke up disoriented for a moment, my body doing that familiar scan pregnancy had trained into me. Back pain, hips tight, bladder urgent, baby moving. Then my memory caught up and the truth settled back onto my ribs. I was in Damien Cross's penthouse again, not as a visitor, not as a ghost who had wandered back into a life she'd escaped, as the center of his attention, as the reason his security system didn't sleep, as the woman he was trying to pull back into his orbit with devotion so intense it felt like gravity. Damien was awake, sitting against the headboard with a tablet in his hands, reading something that looked suspiciously like a medical checklist. He wasn't fully dressed yet, but he looked alert in the way men like him always did, like rest was a luxury he didn't trust. The moment he noticed I was awake, his focus snapped to me, and his eyes did what they always did now. They went to my belly first. My daughter responded with a slow roll, then a kick, as if she had her own opinions about the man who kept pressing his palm to her world like a promise. Damien's face softened for a fraction of a second, and I hated how much that softness still moved me. How easily it reached through my defenses and touched the tired part of me that wanted to believe in home. I left the bed slowly, bracing one hand at my lower back. My body felt like it had been assembled wrong overnight. Pregnancy did that. It rearranged you without asking and then expected you to keep functioning like nothing had changed. In the bathroom mirror, I looked like someone who had survived something. Dark shadows under my eyes, hair flattened on one side, a belly so round it looked like I had swallowed the moon. I told myself to breathe. At 8 in the morning, the penthouse was unusually quiet. Noah wasn't visible, but I felt his presence anyway, like the building itself was a guard dog. Damien moved through the kitchen with a contained energy, not frantic, but purposeful. He didn't hover over breakfast the way he had yesterday. He seemed to be holding himself back, remembering my conditions, remembering that care couldn't become control if he wanted this to work. That effort mattered. It also scared me, because it meant he could change when he wanted to, and I didn't know what would happen when he didn't want to. A knock came at 9:20. At 9:20 in the morning, not a loud knock, not an intrusion. A respectful signal, like whoever was on the other side understood they were entering something delicate. A woman came in carrying garment bags and a case that looked like it belonged to a professional makeup artist. She introduced herself with the kind of calm confidence that said she'd worked around power for a long time. She looked at me the way a tailor looks at fabric, not judging, just assessing, figuring out how to make something fit. I didn't love the idea of being dressed like a doll, But I also couldn't deny how deeply I wanted to feel like myself again, even if it was for one day. The woman laid out options that were all designed to accommodate a belly this big without making it look like a problem to hide. Soft fabric, clean lines, elegant choices that didn't scream innocence or shame. I chose a champagne-colored dress, something warm and understated, because white felt like a lie and black felt like surrender. While she worked, I sat in front of a mirror and watched myself return piece by piece, not transformed into someone else, just restored. Concealer to soften the exhaustion, a little color to bring my face back from the gray edge of stress, waves in my hair that made me look less like a woman running on stubbornness alone. When I looked up at my own reflection afterward, I saw someone worth choosing. That thought nearly made me cry, because I realized how rarely I had felt that way in the last 6 months. At 11:05 in the morning, Damien came to the doorway. He was dressed in a black tuxedo that fit him like it had been built for him and him alone. Clean, sharp, expensive, without flashing labels. He looked devastating in the way men with power often did, like the world had never told them no. But what stole my breath wasn't the suit. It was his expression. He looked at me like he was seeing something impossible. His eyes moved from my face to my belly and back again, and I saw awe there, real and unguarded. I saw the kind of emotion he usually locked away behind steel. For a moment, he looked less like a crime boss and more like a man who couldn't believe the universe had given him another chance. I reminded myself that emotion wasn't proof. Effort was proof. Boundaries were proof. Consistency was proof. Damien offered his arm, but he didn't take my hand without waiting. That pause was small, but it carried weight. It was him acknowledging my autonomy without words. It was him showing me he was trying to become a man who asked, not a man who claimed. I took his arm anyway. Not because he owned me, because I chose to. At 11:30 in the morning, we entered a room I hadn't seen before, converted into something intimate and warm. Flowers filled the air with a soft sweetness. Candles flickered even though the day was bright. A judge stood waiting near a simple altar, and Noah remained at the edge of the room, calm and watchful, as if he was guarding a sacred moment from the outside world. There weren't rows of guests. There wasn't a crowd. It was quiet by design, like Damien understood that my life had already been public enough in the wrong ways. My hands trembled when Damien held them. Not from fear of him, from fear of myself, because it would have been easy to let romance carry me. Easy to let his intensity sweep me into certainty. Easy to forget that a second marriage didn't erase why the first one ended. The judge spoke about commitment and partnership, and I listened with a strange sense of distance, like I was watching my own life from the outside, trying to decide which version of myself was real. The woman who ran, or the woman who stayed. When it came time for Damien to commit, his voice sounded steady, but I noticed his hands. They weren't perfectly still. The slight tremor told me everything he didn't say. He wasn't calm because he didn't care. He was calm because he was fighting not to overwhelm me with how much he cared. When it was my turn, I took a breath and felt my daughter move under my ribs, slow and heavy, like she was pressing her opinion into my body. I said yes, not as a surrender, as a decision. A choice shaped by fear and love and boundaries and the reality that I didn't want to do motherhood alone if the alternative could be partnership. Damien slid a ring onto my finger new, not a repeat of the past, and the weight of it felt different. Not like a chain, like a marker, like a line drawn in ink between who I had been and who I was trying to become. When the judge pronounced it done, Damien pulled me into an embrace careful of my belly, and the kiss he gave me wasn't performative. It wasn't for an audience. It was for the two of us. It was relief, gratitude, devotion, and hunger for redemption pressed into a single breath. For a moment, I let myself feel it without analyzing it to death. Then the room shifted. Noah stepped forward, an envelope in his hand. The timing was too sharp to be coincidence, too immediate to be anything but urgent. Damien's expression hardened slightly as he took it, and the warmth drained from the air like someone had opened a door to winter. He scanned the contents quickly, eyes moving with the speed of a man used to reading threats and turning them into plans. My stomach tightened. I asked, without using words that sounded like panic, what it was. Damien looked at me, then at my belly, then back at the papers, and I saw him make a decision about how much truth I could handle. He told me they had identified who paid for the surveillance. My mouth went dry. The name he gave wasn't a rival I had never met. It wasn't a faceless enemy. It was Ethan Miller, my legal ex-husband. And the room didn't just tilt this time. It cracked. For a few seconds, my brain refused to accept what I had just heard. Ethan Miller. Not a shadowy enemy in Damien's world. Not a rival boss with a grudge. Not some faceless predator looking for leverage. My legal ex-husband. The man whose last name I still carried on paperwork because I hadn't had the money or time to fix everything yet. The man who had smiled for family photos and then quietly stopped answering my calls when real life got inconvenient. The man who had once promised me stability and then treated my heart like an expense he didn't want on his budget. I felt my knees soften. Damien's hand tightened around my waist immediately. Not yanking, not forcing, just bracing me like he'd already learned the exact moment my body would wobble. The room was still dressed in wedding softness, flowers, candlelight, warm colors, but the mood had changed so completely it felt like someone had poured ice water into my lungs. I tried to understand the logic. Ethan didn't know Damien the way I did. He didn't understand the danger that came with being connected to a man like Damien Cross. Ethan had always lived in a world where problems were solved with meetings, lawyers, public relations, and carefully phrased emails. So why would Ethan hire a professional surveillance operation? Why would he spend money tracking a pregnant woman he hadn't cared about in months? The answer arrived before I could keep pretending I didn't know. A baby. My baby. A potential claim. A way to control me again, even from a distance, even after divorce, even after he'd decided I wasn't worth the effort. My stomach twisted so hard I thought I might get sick right there in my champagne dress. I realized I had been imagining the danger wrong. I had assumed predators were always strangers. Sometimes they were men who already knew your weak spots. Damien's gaze stayed on my face, and I saw him measuring my reaction the way he measured threats. Not detached, protective, but careful, like he didn't want to overwhelm me with the wrong kind of truth at the wrong time. Noah remained quietly present nearby, holding himself the way he always did when something could go sideways. Calm outside, ready underneath. I tried to ask how Ethan even knew I was pregnant, because that was the piece that didn't fit. I hadn't told anyone. I hadn't posted anything. I wore baggy clothes at work and avoided people who asked personal questions. I had made my life small on purpose. Damien's expression tightened, and I recognized the shape of irritation there. Not at me. In the world. He explained, in the controlled way he used when he was trying to keep his voice gentle, that the information had leaked from the clinic. The receptionist, Tara Pike. The honeyed smile and the polite voice from the waiting room suddenly replayed in my head like a bad joke. I pictured her hands hovering over the keyboard, her eyes flicking up and down, her expression too practiced to be truly kind. Damien made it clear that Tara had sold information to a gossip site. Not as a dramatic betrayal, just as a transaction, a way to make quick money off someone else's life. My skin went cold. The gossip site, according to Damien, had reached out to Ethan for comment, because I was still legally tied to him on some documents. Because people loved scandal more than they loved privacy. Because the internet never asked permission before turning pain into entertainment. Ethan had put pieces together. He had done the math, the same way Damien had in the waiting room. Only Ethan's conclusion had been selfish, instead of stunned. Damien said Ethan wanted proof. Proof that the baby might be his. Proof he could build a custody claim. Proof he could regain control by putting a child between us like a legal weapon. My hands flew to my belly without me deciding. My daughter moved as if she could feel my pulse spike, as if she disliked the panic flooding my bloodstream. I tried to breathe slowly, the way I had practiced for labor. In, out, in, out. But anger doesn't leave cleanly. Anger sits in your throat and makes you want to spit fire. I thought about all the nights I had cried alone in my studio, exhausted and nauseous, telling myself I didn't need anyone. I thought about Ethan never calling to check on me, never offering help, never asking what I needed. And now he wanted my child. Not because he loved her, because he wanted leverage. Damien's hold on me tightened, and I felt the shift in his body. He wasn't just protective now. He was furious in a way that looked calm from the outside, but I could feel the heat of it through his touch. I asked what Damien had done about it, because I knew he wouldn't just sit with that information. Damien's mouth curved into something sharp, not a smile, a decision. He explained that Ethan would not be making any custody claim. Not now, not later, not ever. He said it with the same certainty he used when he talked about security protocols, as like it was already finished. My heart hammered. Part of me wanted to ask if he had hurt Ethan. Part of me didn't want to know the answer. But Damien didn't take the easy route of vagueness this time. He told me he had handled it strategically. Lawyers, documents, leverage that didn't require blood. He said Ethan was currently leaving the country with a job offer that sounded too good to refuse, tied to a contract that required immediate relocation for years. Not exile in a dramatic sense, just a clean removal from my orbit. Then Damien added the detail that made my stomach drop even harder. Ethan had signed paperwork relinquishing any potential claim to children from our marriage. Permanently. Legally. No loopholes. I stared at Damien, trying to figure out how a man like Ethan would ever agree to that. Damien didn't pretend it was persuasion in the gentle sense. He made it clear he had convinced Ethan that fighting would be a losing game, that the cost would be too high, that Ethan's best option was to take the offer and disappear quietly. I should have felt relieved. I did feel relieved, and the relief came with shame, because it meant I was letting Damien's power solve a problem that my power couldn't touch. It meant my independence still had limits. It meant there were doors I couldn't lock without borrowing someone else's keys. My daughter kicked again, and I flinched. Not from pain, but from the realization that motherhood would bring 1,000 moments like this. Moments where love wasn't enough, where strength wasn't enough, where the world demanded protection that a good heart alone couldn't provide. Damien watched me wrestle with it. I saw his restraint again, the way he didn't rush to claim victory, the way he didn't rub my face in his capability. He just stayed close, present, a shield without words. I thought about my conditions. Violence as a last resort. Power is used intelligently first. Truth in the shape I could handle. Damien had done it in his own way. He had chosen the cleanest path available to him. That mattered. I swallowed hard and tried to steady my voice. I tried to admit the truth without making it sound like surrender. I told him I hated that Ethan had forced this. I hated that my pregnancy had become public knowledge. I hated that my life could be bought and sold by strangers, ex-husbands, and gossip sites. Damien's eyes softened, and I saw something there that wasn't pride. It was regret. The kind that comes from realizing the world you live in spills onto the people you love, no matter how hard you try to contain it. He made it clear he wasn't going to let anyone use me again. Not Ethan. Not Tara. Not the man in the warehouse district. Not anyone. My daughter rolled under my palm, then settled, as if she had decided the storm could pause for a moment. And I realized something quietly terrifying. The big twist wasn't that Ethan had been behind the surveillance. The big twist was what it revealed about my life. I had spent months thinking the danger was Damien, but the truth was, the danger had been everywhere. In polite smiles, in legal loopholes, in men who wanted ownership without love. And standing there with Damien's ring on my finger and my daughter alive inside me, I understood the choice I was making wasn't between freedom and captivity. It was between being unprotected and being protected. Between being alone with threats I couldn't see and being with a man who could see them from miles away. The question wasn't whether Damien Cross was intense. The question was whether that intensity could become a partnership instead of prison. And for the first time since the clinic, I felt something settle in my chest besides fear. A cautious, fragile kind of hope. The ring on my finger felt heavier after the truth about Ethan. Not because it was expensive, though it was, and that still made me uncomfortable in a way I couldn't fully explain, but because it suddenly represented something bigger than romance. It represented coverage, protection, a legal wall built around me and my daughter in a world where people treated women like leverage and babies like bargaining chips. I hated that reality. I also couldn't deny it. After the ceremony, the penthouse didn't stay warm for long. Not emotionally. The flowers still filled the air with sweetness. The candles still flickered. But something had shifted between Damien and me. Like the marriage had been the easy part, and the real work was what came after. Damien didn't press for celebration. He didn't drag me into some picture-perfect moment designed to prove we were happy. That restraint surprised me. Instead, he offered something I hadn't expected. Space. He guided me back to the living area, helped me settle onto the sofa with pillows arranged to support my back and hips, then stepped away to talk quietly with Noah. I watched them through the glass reflection, the way their shoulders angled inward, the way Noah's posture stayed calm even when he spoke. Damien's world ran on silent urgency. Even after a wedding, even after a vow, my daughter shifted, and I rested both hands on my belly, breathing slowly. The baby's movements were the only part of my life that felt uncomplicated. She didn't care about lawyers, surveillance, or power. She only cared about space, warmth, and the steady beat of my heart. Damien returned after a few minutes and crouched beside me, careful, eye level again as he'd done in the clinic. That gesture had once made me feel trapped. Now it made me feel seen. He told me he had something for me. I braced myself for another overwhelming gift. Something too large, too expensive, too permanent. Something that would make me feel like a kept woman instead of a partner. Then he handed me a small box. Inside was a key, not sleek and modern, ornate, old-fashioned. The The kind of key that belonged to a real door, not a digital lock. I stared at it like it was a riddle. Damien watched my face closely, the way he always did when he was trying to decide whether he was doing this right. He explained, in that steady, controlled way, that he had bought a house. Not downtown, not another glass tower, about an hour outside the city. Gated property, privacy, land, air that didn't smell like traffic, a garden, room for a child to grow without feeling like the world was pressing in from all sides. Space. He said the word like he had been listening to me all along, and that broke something open in my chest, because he remembered what I'd said in the nursery, that I didn't want a cage, even a golden one, that I needed room to breathe. A house didn't fix everything, but it showed he was trying to build something around us that wasn't only about his comfort. I asked if it was my house. Damien corrected it softly, making it clear it was ours. A home, not a fortress. A place that didn't require me to live 30 stories above the world to be safe. I hated how quickly tears came. I hated that being offered gentleness made me feel like I might collapse. Like I'd been starving for it so long, my body didn't know how to accept it without shaking. Damien's thumb caught one tear as it fell, the touch warm and careful. He didn't tell me not to cry. He didn't tease me. He didn't demand gratitude. He just held the moment as it mattered. That was new. Or maybe it wasn't new, and I had been too scared to notice it before. Within 48 hours, we moved. Not with boxes and noisy trucks, the way normal people did. Damien's version of moving was controlled and quiet. People I didn't know appeared and vanished. Clothing and essentials showed up without chaos. The nursery items were transported as if they were priceless art, not baby furniture. I should have felt ridiculous. Instead, I felt the strangest thing, relieved. The house was modern but warm, built with clean lines that still felt human. Large windows faced a stretch of trees instead of traffic. The air smelled like wet soil and pine instead of exhaust. There was a kitchen that looked like a place you could actually cook, not just display expensive appliances. And out back, there was a garden. A real one. Not decorative planters, beds of soil. Space for growing things. When I stepped onto the patio for the first time, I inhaled and felt my lungs fill more easily than they had in months. My daughter kicked as if she approved. Damien stayed close, but not suffocating. He watched me take in the space like he was learning what it meant to give someone freedom without losing them. Noah remained present too, but more distant here. Less like a shadow in the living room, more like a guard dog you knew was nearby, even if you didn't see him. The next days blurred into a strange calm that felt fragile. Damien arranged medical care that came to the house. Doctor Lang visited with professional calm, checking my blood pressure, measuring my belly, and listening to my daughter's strong heartbeat. Damien didn't hover in the same suffocating way he had at the penthouse. He stayed near, yes, but he let the doctor speak to me first. He let me answer questions. He let me decide. Small changes, huge meaning. I started to believe, cautiously, that my conditions weren't just words, that he was actually treating them like law. Then, on the 4th day after the wedding, Noah arrived with an update. I was in the garden, barefoot in the grass, one hand on my belly, letting sunlight warm my face. I had been trying to collect simple moments, trying to prove to myself that my life could still hold softness. Noah's presence at the edge of the yard changed the air instantly. Damien appeared beside me like he'd been summoned by instinct, his hand drifting to my back, then pausing, then settling lightly when I didn't pull away. Noah delivered the update in the same calm tone he always used. The surveillance equipment had been destroyed. The files were gone. The person responsible had been dealt with. He didn't define or deal with. He didn't need to. Damien didn't react outwardly. He only nodded once, like he had expected the world to be corrected in that way. I should have been horrified. I was relieved. And that terrified me more than horror would have, because it meant the line I'd drawn about violence was already being tested, and part of me was quietly accepting that the world wasn't fair enough for clean solutions. I stood there in the sunlight, my belly heavy, my heart heavier, realizing that motherhood wasn't going to be about ideal choices. It was going to be about survival choices. Damien looked down at me, and for a moment, I saw the man underneath everything again. The one who didn't want to be poison, who didn't want to be the monster, who just didn't know how to love without fighting the world for the right to keep what he loved. My daughter rolled under my palm. Then, like she was tired of the tension, she kicked once hard and decisive, and I laughed, breathless and surprised, because that kick felt like her voice cutting through all our darkness, reminding us what mattered. Not revenge. Not pride. Not control. Just life. Just her. Just the chance to do this differently than the people who had tried to use us. I looked out at the garden beds, the quiet trees, the stretch of green that didn't feel like a cage, and I made myself a promise. If I were going to stay in Damien Cross's world, I was going to carve a softer corner inside it. Not for him. Not for me. For our daughter. Because she deserved a home, not just protection. At 3:25, the first contraction hit like a fist closing around my spine. It wasn't the dramatic movie version where your water breaks and you immediately start screaming. It was quieter than that. Sneakier. A deep tightening that made me pause mid-breath. One hand flying to my belly as if I could physically hold my uterus in place. I stood in the dark bedroom, barefoot on the warm floor, and waited. The pain eased after a minute, leaving behind a strange emptiness, like my body was asking me to pay attention. My daughter rolled once, then settled low. I felt it in my bones. It was time. Damien was awake before I fully formed the thought. He didn't jerk up in panic. He just shifted, eyes sharp, his body already moving into action, like he'd been rehearsing this moment in his head for weeks. He asked what I felt without making it sound like an order. His voice was steady, low, built to keep my nervous system from catching fire. I told him it was happening. For a second, his face went completely still. Then something in his eyes softened so hard it almost looked like fear. Damien Cross, who could stare down threats without blinking, looked scared. Not of the hospital, not of blood, not of guns, of not being enough for this moment. He helped me sit, then stand, then walk. His hands careful and respectful, pausing whenever I needed him to pause. He didn't scoop me up like a hero. He didn't try to dominate the scene. He followed my pace. That mattered more than any romantic speech could. Noah appeared as if he had been waiting behind the walls. Within minutes, the house felt alive in the quietest way. Doors opening, keys moving, voices kept low. The SUV was ready before my second contraction fully faded. At 3:50 in the morning, I was in the back seat with Damien beside me, his hand in mine, his other hand hovering over my belly like he was afraid to press too hard. The road was dark, empty, slick with leftover night moisture. The trees blurred past. I breathed through the contractions like I'd practiced, counting the seconds in my head, refusing to let fear take over. Damien timed them on his watch with a focus that was almost obsessive. He murmured reassurance under his breath, sometimes in English, sometimes in Italian, as if the language didn't matter and only the intention did. I realized, between waves of pain, that he was trying to make himself useful, trying to earn his place in this moment. The only way he knew how, through action, through precision, through control. I wanted to tell him he didn't need to prove anything right now. But then another contraction hit, and all I could do was breathe and grip his hand until my knuckles went white. At 4:30 a.m., we arrived at a private hospital that didn't feel like a hospital. It felt like a high-end hotel, with medical equipment hidden behind tasteful doors. The staff moved quickly but quietly. They already knew my name. They were already prepared. Damien had arranged the kind of care money could buy without blinking. I should have been irritated by that. Instead, I was grateful. Because pain had a way of stripping you down to the basics. Comfort, safety, help. They brought me to a suite, not a standard room. Soft lighting, a large bed, space for Damien to stay close without being underfoot. A nurse explained procedures and options, and for once, Damien didn't speak over me. He stayed near, eyes fixed on my face, but he let me answer. He let me decide. When they asked if I wanted an epidural, I hesitated. I had told myself I wanted to do this without it, like suffering would prove something. Then the contraction that followed made my vision blur at the edges. I chose the epidural, not because I was weak, because I was practical. Damien's hand squeezed mine gently when I made the choice, and I understood what that squeeze meant. He was proud of me, proud that I could choose without shame, proud that I wasn't letting anyone, him included, decide what strength looked like for my body. Labor stretched time into something strange. Hours blurred. Pain came in waves, even with medication. Pressure built low and heavy until it felt like my body was trying to split itself open to create a new life. I cried. I laughed once, hysterical and breathless, because something about the absurdity of it all hit me how I had been a woman sitting alone in a clinic 6 days ago. And now I was here, in a medical suite, with Damien Cross looking like he would tear the building apart if anyone failed me. At one point, I told him I hated him. Not in a playful way. In that raw labor way, where you hate everyone involved in the existence of pain. Damien didn't flinch. He didn't get offended. He just nodded as if he accepted it as part of the process and told me, quietly, that I was doing it, that I was incredible, that our daughter was almost here, that he was here, that he wasn't leaving. At 12:18 p.m., the room shifted. There's a moment in labor where you stop being afraid and become purely determined. Your body reaches a point where it has no choice but to finish what it started. That's where I was. I pushed with everything I had left. Damien stayed at my side, not squeamish, not distant. His hand held mine. His voice stayed steady. His eyes stayed on my face like I was the only thing that mattered. Then I heard it. A cry. Small, furious, powerful. A sound that made my entire body go weak with relief. They placed her on my chest, warm and slick and perfect, and I looked down at her tiny face like I was seeing the universe in miniature. Dark hair, serious little brows, a mouth that opened again to complain about this world she had been forced into. She was beautiful. She was ours. My heart cracked open so completely I didn't even try to hold it together. Damien made a sound beside me that didn't belong to the man I knew. It wasn't a command. It wasn't a threat. It was a broken, breathless noise, like his soul had been punched clean. His eyes were wet. He reached out with shaking hands, not grabbing, not claiming, just hovering until the nurse guided him, until someone showed him how to hold something fragile without fear. Damien held our daughter like she was the first holy thing he had ever touched. His jaw trembled. His lips parted, like he was trying to speak and couldn't. When he finally leaned down, his voice came out rough and reverent, directed at her tiny face. He whispered a promise he didn't need to perform for anyone else. He promised she would never be hurt. Not while he was alive. Not ever. I watched tears slide down his cheeks, and I realized I was seeing the only thing capable of truly changing him. Not my love. Not my boundaries. Not fear. Fatherhood. Our daughter opened her eyes for the first time, dark and unfocused, and for a second it looked like she stared right into him. Damien broke fully then. He didn't hide it. He didn't wipe the tears away, as if weakness was shameful. He just held her and cried, and the sight of it did something deep inside me. It softened the part of me that had been braced for disappointment. It reminded me that monsters weren't born monsters. Sometimes they were made by the world, and then one small person arrived and gave them a reason to fight, being what they had become. When Damien finally looked up at me, the love in his eyes was almost unbearable. It was devotion stripped of theatrics, devotion made raw and honest by a baby's heartbeat against his palm. He thanked me, not with money, not with gifts, with awe, with humility, with something close to worship. And in that hospital room, with my daughter on my chest and Damien's tears still wet on his face, I realized the strangest truth of all. The most dangerous man I had ever loved was becoming human in my arms. Not because I demanded it, because our daughter had arrived and made it impossible for him to pretend he didn't have a soul. At 14:05, at 2:05 in the afternoon, the room finally quieted. The medical staff moved with that calm efficiency that comes after the biggest moment is over. The lights were softer. The machines beeped less urgently. My body felt hollowed out and rebuilt all at once, like I had left a piece of myself behind and gained something infinitely heavier in return. My daughter slept against my chest, swaddled tight, her tiny fist tucked near her chin like she was already preparing to fight the world. Damien sat beside me on the bed, careful not to jostle her, one arm curved around both of us. He didn't look like himself in that moment. He still wore his expensive coat, but it fit differently now, like fatherhood had altered the seams. His eyes kept drifting down to her face. Every time she made the smallest sound, a sigh, a soft squeak, his entire posture shifted, alert and protective, like his nervous system had rewired around this tiny person. It was overwhelming. It was also beautiful. The nurse asked about paperwork and names, and I realized we hadn't finished that part. We had talked in fragments, in half-serious lists, during sleepless nights, but now she was here, real and breathing, and suddenly the name mattered like a promise. I watched my daughter's face as if she might tell me what she wanted. She didn't. She just slept, utterly unconcerned with the way adults tried to control meaning. I said the name that had been sitting in my mind for months like a quiet lantern. Sophia. Wisdom, hope, light and darkness. A name that didn't belong to Damien's world or my old world. A name that belonged to the future. Damien repeated it under his breath, testing the sound. And when he said Sophia Cross, his voice softened around it like he was trying to learn how to be gentle on purpose. He kissed my forehead, then her head, so carefully it looked like reverence. For a few minutes, I let myself believe we could have simple happiness. Then the door opened. Noah stepped inside. Even in a hospital, even surrounded by nurses and soft blankets and newborn smell, Noah looked like danger in human form. Not because he was threatening, but because he carried threat awareness like oxygen. His suit was immaculate. His expression was neutral. But his eyes held that quiet tension I had learned to read. Damien's hand tightened around mine instantly. Not hurting, just connecting. Like he needed to ground himself before hearing whatever Noah brought. The nurse sensed the shift and stepped out without being asked. Privacy happened around Damien without him needing to demand it. The world simply adjusted. Noah approached and handed Damien an envelope. Again, it hit me like déjà vu. Wedding and paperwork, birth and paperwork. It felt like our life came with constant updates from the outside world, reminders that safety required maintenance. Damien opened it and scanned quickly. I watched his face change in slow degrees. The tenderness didn't vanish completely this time. It got buried. His eyes hardened. His jaw set. The part of him that belonged to violence and strategy rose like a shield. I asked what it was, already knowing I wouldn't like the answer. Noah explained it before Damien could decide how much truth to give me. The man in the warehouse district had talked. Not willingly, not kindly. But the information had been extracted, and the pattern had a purpose. It wasn't random stalking. It wasn't a sick hobby. It was recruitment. Sophia wasn't the only target. She was one of many future pieces, babies linked to powerful families. Babies whose existence could become leverage later. Babies whose mothers could be pressured, blackmailed, broken. A long-term plan. A network. My arms tightened around my newborn without me thinking. My body went cold in a way it hadn't even during labor because it wasn't just that someone had watched me. Someone had planned beyond me. Someone had looked at pregnant women and seen an investment. Damien's voice stayed low when he spoke, but there was something lethal in the control of it. He asked Noah where the network traced back to. Noah hesitated for half a second, then said the name. Not Ethan. Not Tara. Not a faceless stranger. A rival outfit Damien had been dealing with quietly for months. A crew that operated through intermediaries and contractors, staying clean enough to avoid headlines, dirty enough to ruin lives in silence. It wasn't a personal vendetta. It was business. And that was worse, because business didn't stop just because you begged. I felt my stomach twist, even empty after birth. My milk hadn't even come in yet, and I already felt like my body was failing to keep up with the danger. Damien looked down at Sophia, and his expression shifted again. The rage in him wasn't only anger. It was fear turned outward. A man like Damien didn't cope with fear by trembling. He coped by removing the source. Noah asked for orders. I could see it happen before Damien spoke. The same stillness as before. That moment where he stopped negotiating with morality and started thinking like a predator. He was about to solve this the way he always solved threats. Fast. Final. Permanent. My conditions echoed in my head, louder now. Violence as a last resort. Power is used intelligently first. No revenge. Raising our daughter. My throat tightened because I realized this was the first real test of our new marriage. Not the ring. Not the vows. Not the nursery. This. What Damien did when someone threatened our child. I forced myself to sit up straighter, cradling Sophia close. I told Damien, in the calmest voice I could manage, that I needed him to hear me. Damien's eyes lifted to mine, and for a moment I saw conflict there. He wanted to protect. I wanted protection too, but I also wanted a future that wasn't built entirely on violence. I said we could not raise Sophia in a world where her father's love meant bodies. I told him I understood the fear, because I felt it too. But if he handled this in the bloodiest way possible, we were setting a precedent. We were teaching ourselves that every threat required destruction. I admitted the truth that hurt to admit. If he crossed certain lines for us, part of me would never unsee it, and I could live beside darkness. But I couldn't let darkness become the only language in our home. Noah stood very still, eyes forward, as if he didn't want to witness the argument between love and power. Damien didn't speak for a long moment. His gaze dropped to Sophia. She made a tiny sound in her sleep, a soft complaint, then relaxed again, trusting without knowing what trust cost. Damien's breathing changed. I felt his chest rise and fall more slowly, like he was forcing himself to come back from the edge. Then he did something I didn't expect. He nodded. Not fully, not easily, but once, sharp and decisive. He told Noah, with a controlled voice, that they would start with the clean route. Lawyers first. Pressure points. Financial chokeholds. A dismantling that made the network collapse without turning our daughter's birth into a bloodbath. He didn't promise there would be no violence. He didn't lie. But he did promise he would try my way first. And that promise, small, imperfect, real, felt like the first true gift he had ever given me. Because it meant he wasn't just protecting us. He was learning to protect our future. Noah left the room to execute the orders, and the hospital suite fell quiet again. Damien looked at me, eyes still dark, still intense, but softer at the edges. He told me, without romantic words, that he could not lose us. The thought of Sophia as leverage made something animal in him wake up, and I believed him. I also believed what I had realized in this moment. Love wasn't enough. Protection wasn't enough. The only thing that would make this marriage real was whether Damien could choose restraint when rage would be easier. I shifted Sophia slightly, feeling her warmth against my chest, and I made my own choice too. I wasn't staying because I was trapped. I wasn't staying because I was afraid to leave. I was staying because I had seen Damien bend just a little for our daughter, because I had seen him try to become the kind of man who could keep us safe without turning our home into a war zone, and because I knew, with a clarity that surprised me, that if he ever stopped trying, I would walk, even if it broke my heart, even if it terrified me, because Sophia deserved a father, and she deserved a mother who didn't disappear inside someone else's protection. By the time Sophia was 6 months old, my life had a rhythm again, not the frantic survival rhythm of my studio apartment days, where every morning felt like a sprint to keep my head above water, and not the suffocating penthouse rhythm either, where security and wealth wrapped around me so tightly it was hard to tell where I ended, and Damien's world began. This rhythm was quieter, earned. The house outside the city had become real in the way places only become real when you live inside them long enough to leave fingerprints on everything. The garden beds had started to produce herbs and tomatoes. The kitchen smelled like actual meals instead of catered perfection. The nursery looked lived in soft blankets, toys, little socks that seemed impossible for a human being to fit into. And Sophia filled every space with her existence. She laughed easily, loudly, like she didn't know how to be small. Her eyes were dark and curious, constantly tracking Damien like he was the most fascinating thing in the world. She reached for him whenever he entered a room, chubby hands opening and closing like she was casting a spell. Damien pretended he wasn't undone by it. He failed. He was still Damien Cross, still controlled, still intense, still a man who carried danger under his skin. But fatherhood had changed the way his intensity showed up. It wasn't only possessiveness anymore. It was present. He came home earlier. He worked from the house more often. He took calls in the office and then emerged with his sleeves rolled up to warm a bottle, like that was the real appointment that mattered. Noah remained part of our lives, but the security details evolved. Less visible, smarter. Cameras tucked into the property line. Vehicles that passed at predictable times. Men who rotated shifts without ever announcing themselves. Protection became background noise instead of a cage. And Damien, to his credit, kept the bargain he had made in that hospital room. He didn't turn every problem into a battlefield. I learned, slowly, what that meant in practice. It meant lawyers moving like silent sharks in suits, swallowing threats through paperwork and pressure. It meant financial networks being choked until rival crews started turning on each other out of desperation. It meant people disappearing from our orbit, not with bodies, but with buyouts, relocations, and agreements signed under the weight of consequences. It wasn't clean in a moral sense, but it was cleaner than it could have been. And when I asked questions the shape of the truth, not the gore, Damien answered enough to keep me from living in the dark. That was growth. That was an effort. That was love trying to behave. Sometimes, late at night after Sophia finally slept, Damien would sit on the edge of our bed with her baby monitor in hand like it was a sacred object. He'd stare at the screen, listening to her breathing, as if he was still stunned she existed. On those nights, his guard would slip just a little. He would confess, in the quietest way, that he still woke up afraid I would be gone, that he still carried guilt like a stone in his chest for letting me leave the first time, that he still believed he was dangerous, and he hated that the people he loved most were forced to live with that danger. I never had a perfect answer for him. I only had the truth, that he couldn't rewrite his past, but he could choose his future, and he was choosing. That mattered. Our marriage wasn't a fairy tale. We argued. We clashed. Damien's instincts still ran toward control when fear hit him. My instincts still ran toward independence when I felt pressured. Sometimes those instincts collided like storms. There were days I snapped at him for hovering. There were nights he went too quiet, too cold, slipping into the man I remembered from the worst parts of our old life. But then Sophia would laugh, or babble, or reach her hands toward us like she was pulling us back into the same room, and we would remember what we were building. We started doing small, normal things on purpose. A walk in the garden with Sophia bundled in a carrier against Damien's chest. A trip into town with Noah at a distance, Damien forcing himself to let me choose the route, the time, the pace. Dinner at the kitchen table with no phones allowed, Damien actually placing his device face down as it hurt him to do it. Sometimes he would rock Sophia to sleep and hum something under his breath. Not a lullaby I recognized. Something in Italian, low and soft, like a prayer he didn't want anyone else to hear. The first time I saw him do it, my chest ached so sharply I had to look away, because it reminded me that even monsters had tenderness. They just didn't always know what to do with it. One afternoon, when Sophia was around 5 months old, Noah arrived with a short report. The network that had been targeting pregnant women was gone. Not smashed in a public spectacle, not burned down in a way that would make headlines. Dismantled. People arrested on unrelated charges. Money trails exposed. Contractors flipped. Surveillance rings shut down. Quiet pressure was applied until the whole structure collapsed under its own weight. Damien listened, nodded once, then returned to the living room and dropped onto the rug beside Sophia as if he hadn't just finished talking about an operation that had probably taken dozens of moving parts. Sophia squealed and slapped his cheek with her tiny hand. Damien closed his eyes briefly and let her do it, like he was absorbing the innocence the way some men absorbed sunlight. I sat on the sofa and watched him, and something warm settled in my chest. Something I didn't have words for yet. Peace, maybe. Not the kind you're given. The kind you build while fighting off storms. That evening, after Sophia fell asleep, Damien came out onto the porch with me. The air smelled like pine and damp earth. The sky was clear, scattered with stars. He stood behind me, hands resting gently on my shoulders. Not gripping, not claiming, just present. I realized how much that mattered. The way he had learned to touch me was that I belonged to myself too. He told me he loved us, not in a dramatic way, in a steady way, like he was anchoring himself to the truth. I leaned back into him and let myself believe it without flinching, because the truth was, I loved him too. Not blindly, not foolishly, with my eyes open to who he was and who he was trying to become, with boundaries, with conditions, with the hard-earned understanding that love wasn't about possession. It was about choice over and over again. I looked out at the garden, at the quiet property that finally felt like ours, and I thought about the woman I had been in that clinic waiting room. Exhausted, alone, carrying a secret like a burden. If she could see me now, Sophia asleep inside, Damien behind me, the world quieter, she might not believe it was real. But it was real. Messy. Complicated. Sometimes still scary. And ours. So if you're listening to this and you've ever felt like your life was over after betrayal, if you've ever thought you had to do everything alone to be strong, I want you to hear me. Strength isn't only running. Sometimes, strength is negotiating. Sometimes it's demanding respect from someone who loves you the wrong way and watching to see if they learn. Sometimes it's letting yourself accept help without disappearing inside it. And sometimes, when you least expect it, life gives you a second chance that doesn't look perfect, but it looks like home. If this story hit you anywhere in the chest, do me a favor, like, share, and comment what you would have done in my place. Would you have walked away for good? Or would you have stayed and fought to build something better?